All right, so I hope this is working because I can't see any participants. But I am super excited that everybody's here to enjoy the work of my good friend, Justin Randolph Thompson. And I am super excited about attending this webinar to see his work. I've known Justin for, I think it's been a decade maybe, and have really enjoyed watching what he's done, and then also getting really excited about how his career has evolved over the years and the kinds of things that he's interested in now. So I'm just going to read a brief bio and turn it over to him so I don't waste any more of your time. Justin Randolph Thompson is a new media artist, organizer, and educator born in Peekskill, New York in '79. Living between Italy and the US since 2001, he is a co-founder and director of Black History Month Florence. Justin's work and scholarship engages local communities as living yet fleeting monuments. Thompson teaches art at several universities and develops strategies for initiation of annual and biennial cultural projects of international collaboration. His art has been exhibited internationally in venues such as the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Reina Sofia, and the American Academy in Rome. Thompson is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Louis Comfort Tiffany Award, a Franklin Furnace Fund grant, and a Visual Artist grant from the Marcelino Botin Foundation. And on a personal note, I have been jealous of his work and his career for the entire time that I've known him. So I know you're going to enjoy it, and I'm excited to hear it myself.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction. And so I think what I'll do is I'm going to walk through a number of things. I think that the idea of this webinar is to try to cover a lot of the different facets of my work. Coming up through school, I studied a lot of different things. I entered into art school as a painter, and I definitely left painting, but I left also having taken on cinematography, sculpture, installation, and a range of different things that I didn't expect. One of the critiques that I've received, there's two sort of important, I guess, biographical details. One of the critiques that I've received pretty much my entire life is that I take on too much. So the critique to sort of do less projects, to develop less strategies, all of these kinds of things, in order to sort of concentrate and focus on just a few to make them stronger. The other biographical, of course, I've rejected that critique throughout my entire life as well. But then the other biographical note is that as a kid, my parents called me Mr. Correct-All. Because I had a way of thinking about language that was really specific and strategic. And so when anyone would say something to me, I would be quick to correct or to sort of assist in arriving at a more precise definition of what people were trying to say. It's a really annoying trait in children, but it was something I think really brings me into thinking about the ways in which we present ourselves, the ways in which things are presented to us, and our sort of agency in these things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to the whole range of the work that I do. The complexity of that is really just about the fact that I don't really separate myself as an artist, as a teacher, as a father, and as an activist. These things are all just simply facets of what I'm working on. And the core of everything that I'm doing is actually pretty much the same. And so in order to sort of introduce, I'm going to share my screen now with you and sort of go through a PowerPoint that I put together that hopefully is one that will help us to sort of get a stronger sense of my work. So hold on one second, I'm trying to get this, sorry, just give me 1 second to open it. I think my PowerPoint quit unexpectedly. What I'm going to be showing you is I'm actually going to begin with something that was commissioned of me recently. As most of you know, in this period where we have a lot of, well, just really a lot of different online events, it's been commissioned of me recently to, oh, I think what happened, I know what happened. Sorry about that. it's been commissioned of me to actually begin thinking about how to put together some online content that actually frames a lot of the ways in which I think about work. In my bio, it was stated that I've been coming back and forth between Italy and the United States since 2001. The actuality is that I actually moved over here in 1999 as a student, and in a certain sense, I never really left. And so, you know, this has really been the place where I developed my career. When I came over here originally, I was 20 years old, and everything about this place sort of turned me into the artist that I am, and really the kinds of reflections that I have. Sorry, having a little tech difficulty with pulling this up, so just give me 1 second. And so I think that, you know, a lot of what would happen is when I first decided that I was going to be coming over to Italy, it was asked of me to look at, of course, the kind of art that was being made here. And in looking at the art that was being made here, I was actually really trapped at the time in a lot of the ways in which that art was being presented to me. A lot of the ways in which it was being presented was actually full of a very specific framing that unfortunately didn't really fit the kinds of things that I was interested in. And so what happened is that ultimately I ended up taking a long time to really arrive at an understanding of the ways in which I might be able to create for myself. Oh my goodness. Create for myself a path for looking at this art and for engaging it. A lot of the framing is what I'm going to sort of walk you through. Sorry, having a little bit more technical difficulty. This was just open, but somehow we're back here. I made a very hefty PowerPoint presentation to walk you all through. So I think the difficulty is just simply that I've got a large file. But as this opens, okay, here, we're just going to go ahead and try it like this. And what I'll do is I've got another presentation that I can use in the case that this doesn't work, although I did really work to get this going for us today. Okay, well, I think instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to open in a different way. So I'm going to do this in a way that's a little bit different in that I'm going to walk you through a number of things with a little bit less formality because of the nature of this PowerPoint presentation, which I had just created. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and try to eject this and come back in. But I'll give you a little bit of background on the way that, that I work and the way that I think, so that by the time we get into this PowerPoint presentation, we'll have a little bit more of a sense. Sorry again for the tech. I promise it'll be worth the wait. Basically, all of the things that I do, you can see behind me, have continued to sort of evolve. And actually in my own work and in my activism, one of the things that has become really central to my own reflection is ways of thinking about my own position and my own positionality in the space of Italy as an African-American, and what that means in regards to a space that has Black history written in its roots going back beyond the origins of the territory itself. And so these have become things that sort of shape the way that I think about the work that I do and about what we're actually, what work needs to be done. One of the things that's actually quite complex is that the ways in which people frame and think about Italy tends to be void of these conversations, which is why the ways in which art was being framed for me didn't really fit what I was after. And so it's been a long process of sort of breaking things down and reconstructing. I'm hoping, if you give me one more second, I'm hoping I can get this PowerPoint presentation open and we can sort of dive into these views. I was going to start with a commission that was done by a curator by the name of Giuliana Benassi, who asked me to basically respond to a series of very simple questions with single images. And it's sort of like a creative prompt, which I think as a professional artist, we don't get enough of those. I think as students, there's a lot of ways in which we're always asked to create new projects. We're always asked to sort of respond to certain things. Whereas as a, you know, as a professional working artist, we sort of don't get asked those things, basically. I'm copying this to my best time in the meantime. And so the first questions were actually about positionality, about my, the artistic references, what people I was looking at, and then about my relationship to the city I live in. And what was asked of me was basically to create single images that carried these things. Here we go, I found it. Single images that carried these ideas. And oh, I finally got this open. You guys will be happy now. Sorry. Oh man, sincere apologies for that. Here we go. And here we go with the share, so you don't have to just listen to me, but you can actually see some of what I have to say. This lecture, getting a little bit more formal now, is called Black Posterity. And for those of you that are not familiar with the images that you're looking at here, these are charts that were made by W.B. Du Bois in 1900 for what was then a the Paris exposition. And what he was doing was talking about the assessed value of the household and different aspects of value connected to Black life in the United States, specifically looking at the state of Georgia. And what I love about these images is that the way in which they are designed is not a necessary component for communicating the information that's there. It's clearly not typical charts. And so I like to think about the ways in which the aesthetics that go into the creation of these become a way for us to actually begin to feel what's happening in a way that we would not be able to if it were not drawn in this way. This piece has been put together as, it's called Black Posterity, sort of thinking about the things in which preceded us and where we're going. These are the first two images that I wanted to share with you, and they're part, again, of the sort of creative prompts that were given to me. The image on the left, it was asked of me, what is my position in relation to the art world? And I think a lot of the way in which I understand my position in relation to the art world is quite hybrid and complex. I have a sort of love-hate relationship in that the art world itself, as a sort of series of social exchanges, most of which are not all that socially engaged, is not all that interesting to me. The art context as an exhibition venue is also not my favorite space to work in. And so obviously the language of art and its capacity to completely transform people's ability to see and think is something I'm in love with. So the images on the left that you see on top, you're seeing actually African-American soldiers right after World War II that ironically returned the ashes of Christopher Columbus to the city of Geneva. And so I'm interested in the ways in which, you know, these Black soldiers are, you know, celebrated as the liberators, of course, and the ways in which we know what they were fighting for in that moment. And we also know what that turned into when they returned to a segregated United States of America, especially in the South, of course. And what you see below that is a performance piece that I did in relation to that same triumphal arch a few years back. That was sort of thinking about this idea of sort of triumph of carrying these things back and some of the fallibility of that. The image you see on the right instead was in relation to the question about art references. Who are artists that I like to reference or like to think about? And in this case, for me, it's a little bit easier. I tend not to look at visual artists. I tend to look at artists in a broader sense. And I tend to look at just individuals that for me, I like to draw upon. In this case, what you're looking at is on the bottom, an image from 1949 of Paul Robeson, who, for those of you that don't know, was an athlete, an activist, a singer, an actor. He did a lot of things, and he's somebody who was, you know, pretty single-handedly, well, in large part responsible for bringing African-American spirituals into a really popular realm. He also was responsible for bringing African-American spirituals into the classical realm. These are all things that he did through his song. He's a baritone singer. And what you're looking at, the strangeness of this image on the bottom, is that this is him performing from the back of a pickup truck in Peekskill, New York, which is the city I was born in. He's performing from that pickup truck because there was what was termed a race riot, but ultimately what was a number of white veterans that were attacking concert goers because they didn't appreciate the fact that Robeson made statements about the fact that he didn't think that African-American soldiers should be fighting for a country that is unwilling to protect their rights. What you see above that image instead is a performance piece that I did in Peekskill, New York, 65 years later. And that was a way of sort of thinking about the space that I grew up in and the ways in which the narration around the name Paul Robeson was so limited in the way in which it needed to be expanded upon. One of the things that I'm always looking for is how to add complexity. And so I'll share with you the third response, which is a video response. It's a 1 minute, actually 15-second video response. And they asked me what my relationship to the city I live in was. And so this is my answer. And the sound and image came from two separate aspects of my work. The sound came from actually a performance that I did where I had friends that were shooting some of my sculptures with slingshots at giant bass drums while a bass player was playing. The image instead is one that comes from a project that is ongoing as a reflection on sort of monumentality and specifically looking at this triumphal arch, which was erected with all of the wonderful Roman gods, but was erected in the 1800s. The image that you see on the left here, these correspond to two other prompts that were asked of me. One was so these were about work. And honestly, my entire, body of creation is dedicated to labor and to work. So the image you see on the left is my response to the question, what is your craft? And a lot of the work that I do is inspired, of course, by things that I recognize in my own way of reimagining what these images and objects actually carry with them. Of course, they're layered and it's more complex than that. But what you see on top is Francisco Goya's The Straw Mannequin. And what you see on the bottom instead is a performance piece that I did in 2012 in New York City that was called Tossin' the Rag. And it was, in a certain sense, about forms of liberation and redemption. But it consisted in 5 dancers that sort of created this funerary procession with a rag doll just to end in sort of a celebratory tossing of this figure up into the air. This was performed on 14th Street. We did it from traveling the entire length of that street from east to west. What you see on the right instead is again Goya on top, and it's from a painting that is called The Grease Pole, La Cucaña. And basically that painting is of a folk tradition in which people would strip the branches off of a tree, grease up that tree, and then climb it. Usually at the top, they would put bread and other goods that people were interested in sort of capturing as a sort of prize, as a sort of right. And this was about celebrating the harvest. What I was interested in is the ways in which the language of grease pole or the greasy pole has become embraced by the corporate world and the political world as a reflection on the sort of social standing of things and the ways in which it's a greasy climb, it's a really dirty climb, and all the goods are at the top. But my own reflection in terms of my own work is that, if you ask me, what my role in regards to the grease pole would be, it's not about climbing it. I'm not very interested in climbing the pole and arriving at the goods. I'm interested in applying grease to it. I think we need some complexity. We need some difficulty in terms of arriving at the things that we've set at the top as our objectives. And so this is from a 2012 performance called Meet Me in the Bottoms that I did in Texas and San Antonio at the Blue Star Contemporary Art Museum, in which I had a number of students from a performance arts class whose only role was to apply red grease, machine grease, to these quilted palm trees that I created. The grease is called red and tacky. And then I had a third question was asked to me, which is, what are your materials? And this is my answer to that question. And so what you saw there was part of a performance video that I created in which I was using forms of sign language to, along with a sign language interpreter, to create the mission statement of this socially driven space that I was showing in, but who, in my opinion, whose actions were not really conforming to the social mission that they set out for themselves. And so I was thinking about what it means to sort of set this mission out for yourself, but not actually do anything in regards to it, or to sort of bend away from some of those core values. The sound you heard was instead just an incredibly slowed down version of the national anthem played by a marching band. These images here are responding to the last three questions that I received. They were talking about the kind of ways in which, as artists, we draw from what's in the air. We simply grab things and sort of take them. And the question was very simple. It was, what are you grabbing from the air right now? And I think, you know, I had an exhibition right as following lockdown here in Italy. And it was an exhibition that was designed as a sort of response to the social distancing that was happening in Florence, but also, as you can imagine, the city of Florence is very famous for all of its monuments, and it is flooded with tourists all year round. And so what happened with the lockdown and with the arrival of COVID in the country of Italy is that Florence became emptied of all the tourists, and what you were left with was very eye-opening, because it was the locals. And it's something you weren't able to sort of pick out in your day-to-day before that moment. And this gallery decided they wanted to invite all local artists to think about what it meant for us to come together, and to think about how do we map what's actually happening here. The exhibition space is in Via Pandolfini, which is the same street where one of my heroes, political heroes, Alessandro Sinigaglia, was killed. He was a Black Italian resistance fighter, whose mother was African-American, actually from Missouri, who arrived in Italy in the late 1800s, and had him with a Italian Jewish man. And I've been really interested in the ways in which this figure, who was a communist and very directly engaged in fighting fascism, the ways in which this figure actually embraces these worlds with this African-American origin and the sort of resistance of Black history, coupled with the resistance of an actual fight against fascism here. And I was also, of course, very interested, I'm always interested in monuments. And the monument that exists outside of the building is actually one that just simply says that he was killed brutally by Nazi fascists. And so it doesn't really say very much about this person's life. It just commemorates the death. And so I've been really interested in what it means to commemorate only the death of a figure, and the ways in which that may or may not assist us in sort of moving forward in time. So I created my own version of that placard in scale. It's made with wood that is coated with shoe polish, and the lettering, I removed all of the words except for brutally killed in his name, and then the signature of La Resistenza Fiorentina, which actually means the resistance of Florence, and it's actually a way of saying the resistance fighters. The entire thing is made of matches, and they're not only made of matches, but they're made of government taxed matches. So they're matches that are tracked by the Italian government. And so I've been thinking a little bit about that potential of what it means to sort of get rid of this, and maybe sort of a certain need we might feel to get rid of this, but then also just the precarity of monumentality in general. The last image that you see on the right is instead a question that was asked, which is, what do I do with my free time? I'm personally a bit of a workaholic, so I don't really deal with free time all that much. But I've been really interested in what it means to commemorate and create monuments to rest. And this is one reflection that you see above, a sculptural reference on that. And on the bottom, what you see is instead a study that was being prepared by a muralist that I really like, who's from Barcelona, Jose Maria Sert. And I'm interested in the ways in which this demonstrates a certain preparation, artistic preparation. And I like to think of rest as this form of preparation. And the last question is, you know, what do you do? What do you consider your lost time? And this is my response.
Get ready. Get ready. Get ready. Ready. Get ready. Ready. Get ready. Ready. Get ready.
So what you're looking at there is a fragment of a film piece that I created that is called Minted in Enemy Bronze. It's a work in progress that will probably be going on for the better part of my life. Thinking a little bit about a range of considerations of Italian colonial history, coupled with the US military occupation of Florence and of Tuscany more broadly. The sound that you heard instead is a performance draft for a piece that was done in Geneva in response to the first image that I showed you. This here is another detail of the project Fit the Battle, which is the project I did dedicated to Paul Robeson in Peekskill, New York, where I was born. And I think I wanted to share with you some of the ways that for me, everything that I do, I'm interested in it not just happening once, but us having a moment to be able to revisit it, update it, rethink it, completely re-strategize, and go into some different kind of depth. I like to think about the gatherings of certain communities, a lot of which come together simply because of the art that I'm making, right? So invitations, or in this case, what you're looking at is a bunch of artists in residence that I was working with, and interns at a sculpture park that wasn't far from Peekskill. And I asked them to all come in and help me install this. We had this really amazing day. The two people that you see in the center are two singers from the church right there in Peekskill that I invited to be with us. And the person you see who's up on the podium speaking is Mark Anthony Neal, who's an incredible scholar of Black popular culture. And I asked him to sort of step directly into the performance and speak to Paul Robeson. I like collapsing these things and not creating big distinctions between the sort of academic research and artistic research. Both things are core to how I work. The other thing that's core to how I work is organization. And so this is a highly orchestrated moment where incredible, I think I spent my entire Louis Comfort Tiffany Award on this project. And it lasted all of 30 minutes, and there was probably 20 people in the audience. And so really working strategically, not to be practical, but to sort of really create these moments and thinking about how important these moments are in their being created in the first place. But I think, I wanted to share the way in which, for me, every project needs a continuation. So this is fitthebattle.com. It's a website that I created that's about this performance. And it was designed with the thought that, maybe 5 years later, I would go back to Peekskill and revisit and rethink about it. That's something I've been applying to grants for many years now, since I did that first performance in 2013, but I have not been successful in doing yet. That doesn't mean anything. For me, these are lifetime things that I'm working on, but this is an example of one of the proposals that I put together to sort of think about a 5-chapter version of this that is called Wake Up, Jacob. So just to talk about the ways in which each project actually builds upon itself and takes on new layers. And for me, I love writing proposals because they give me the opportunity to really think things. And that's precisely what you're seeing here. This image here comes from another kind of work that I created that is instead, it's more of I wanted to think about what it meant to not create aesthetics, but to allow the gathering of people to create the aesthetics themselves. A lot of my work has been really reliant on the sculptural objects or the painterly objects that exist around them. And I wanted to try something else. This project is called Frisk and the Whiskers, and it's a meditation on labor. But this time thinking about jazz musicians and the labor of jazz, the labor of art, and the ways in which those things are so undervalued and underfunded. And what I wanted to do was to create sort of a celebratory moment for people to come together based on something that was called the Rent Party. The rent party is something that came up really around the 20s, where jazz musicians, when they didn't have the rent money, would host a party. People would pay a really nominal fee to get in the door. The jazz musicians would play their music, and at the end of the day, they could pay their rent. So I wanted to kind of create a reflection on that. And so I put an open call to, jazz musicians to come together and do a series of saxophone battles. And the saxophone battles were divided for weight category, in this case, like boxers. In this case, this is the heavyweight section, and these are baritone saxophones. And they were meant to sort of battle each other the way that MCs, so hip hoppers, would battle each other. And they were doing so over live DJ mixes of some of the historic musicians of the area. In this case, this is New York City, and they're standing right next to Charlie Parker's home in the East Village. And so that we were performing on the front stoops of these historic houses as a way of commemorating and giving sort of a shout out. I invited a series of ethnomusicologists to come in and write poetic shout outs to those jazz musicians who we were celebrating. And the man you see in the middle here, that's Bill Saxton. He's one of the 5 jazz legends that I invited in to be the judge. So it's sort of this intergenerational thing where you get people together, you really start to think about the economics of jazz, you think about the power of exchange, the celebration of history. Every single person that was involved in this project was paid to be involved in it, because this is a project about the economics, and it was really important that they would be paid to be there. But then each of the 5 different bouts that were held, there was prize money. And then the final bout would give you New York City rent money. It was $3,000. So it's basically a grant that I developed. And I also, in this case, there's a website that followed. This is just an image of some of the musicologists that I had worked with. And this is another project that I did a few sort of tentative iterations of following the original run, and have just been unsuccessful in securing funding for it. It's morphed into a project that's called Money Jungle. And this is something I'm still working on getting money for. And again, these are lifetime things, so I'm not super concerned or in a rush. But these are things that are constantly on my mind, because I don't think that the first iteration of anything is really it. I think it's irresponsible in a certain sense to do that. In the same way that I think it's irresponsible for a museum to do an exhibition, for example, dedicated to Black lives, if then in their regular programming going forth in time, they do not revisit it, do programming that demonstrates that this is actually of interest to them, right? And I think it's really something, again, about the fact of us gathering, of us coming back together around certain reflections. It's something that I think is a really powerful way of creating memory and memorial. I wanted to cite a couple figures that I think are really important to the ways in which I like to think about things. This is Anna Julia Cooper. And this is just a quote. This is one of the only women that was at the first Pan-African conference as a speaker in London in 1900. And there's some really amazing quotes around intersectionality that she delivered and that she delivers. I invite all of you to take some time and go look at her. So she has this really wonderful quote here. It says, "Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage. Then and there, the whole Negro race enters with me." And I really like the way in which this is centered on ideas of positionality, and also really a broader reflection on the kinds of values that need to be instilled in order for us to actually move forward, or even just simply go through the door. There's another quote from her here. And I really liked just the honesty of this quote, and the way in which it's asking for a certain form of honesty. So what I hope to see before I die is a Black man honestly and appreciatively portraying the Negro as he is, and the white man occasionally as seen from the Negro standpoint. And I think that these kinds of reflections on, again, positionality and the ways in which we're so, in these moments of history, this is 1858 when she's born, in the late 1800s, a lot of the portrayals, especially in art, of Black people were portrayals that were done from the perspective of white people. And she's asking for that shift. And in asking for that shift, she's not just asking for the portrayal of Black people to be done by Black people, but she's asking also for the portrayal of white people to be done by Black people. And I think that these kinds of conversations are interesting and really important, and certainly not to be taken for granted. But there are some obstacles, right? Including the obstacles to the legibility of this font that I decided to use. Some of these obstacles are really ingrained in us. And so I'd like to address them really, really quickly so that we can walk towards some of the broader work that I do. First one, believe it or not, authority is a huge obstacle. So authority is the power or right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. I think we all know enough about authority, but one of the things that I like to think about in relation to authority is what gives somebody authority. What, when we think about these historic experiments, right, about administering shocks, people simply trusted that if this person was a scientist, then what they were doing was right, despite their best, their ethics and everything. And I like to think about authority through that lens, but I like to think about it also the ways in which, when I was given a history book in my middle school and high school class, I was never pushed or invited to look at who wrote it or to think about who that author was and why they would have written what they wrote. It was just given to me as the authority on history, and so it was given to me as the history. This is similar to when I said I was coming to Italy and I was looking at the sculptures and the art and not really seeing myself there. It's because I was believing in a certain authority to interpret those works that was given to me, that packaged them in a way that really excluded my vantage point and my capacity to enter. The thing that comes with authority, of course, is legitimacy. And I think I'll go with the second definition here in our case, the ability to be defended with logic or justification, validity. And I think, there's a wonderful essay that I think is called A Letter to the Teachers by James Baldwin, in which he talks about the conflict between real education, which is about pushing students into a place of profound questioning of everything, including the professor, and the sort of norms of society. In the ways in which society needs all of us to feel a certain sense of security and faith towards each other, any sort of active questioning disrupts a lot of that sense of security, of course. And so, I like to think about, this idea of legitimacy in relation to all of the things that we're encountering and thinking about as well. So certainly in regards to authority, legitimacy needs to be challenged in a certain sense. And it's not to be challenged to be sort of hacked down, but instead it's just to sort of verify a couple of things, right? This is why when you get a really inquisitive person, when you meet someone, you ask them a few questions, you're trying to figure out where they come from, where they stand. This is a form of questioning the legitimacy and then arriving ultimately maybe at the thought that, yeah, this is legitimate. And I think it's important to think about the ways in which a lot of us are authorities in very specific things and not in everything. And so also thinking about these limitations. This is my wonderful graph, which I have no idea where I got it. Sorry, I don't remember. But it's one that I like to go back to every now and then because I really think it's important for us to think about the overlap of these things. And going back to the very first image I shared with you of W.B. Du Bois, I like the fact that this uses color theory and that it's fairly accurate color theory. And so it didn't need that. But for me, the overlapping of the graphic of this and what it has to say about the relationship between power, legitimacy, and urgency is really incredible. And for me, it's something, again, that I always go back to and like to think about as a sort of defining factor. And then, because I'm an artist, I like to think about the ways in which the sort of legitimacy of art is certainly challenged. Unfortunately, we have a hard time in people believing that what we do is an actual real job and has real value for society, despite all of the evidence to the contrary. So I like this little quote here. This is the fact that much, if not all, of modern art is regarded as a dubious or perhaps downright fraudulent activity by a substantial proportion of at least four groups of people: the general public, i.e. the working class, the tabloid press and related media journalists, newscasters, current affairs pundits, etc. A section of the educated cultural middle class, and the Philistine bourgeois proper. And if you took note of these four sections, there's not a whole lot of sections that fall outside of these. And so basically it's just saying that a substantial portion of everyone believes that art is a downright fraudulent activity. And so when you're trying to use art to embrace social change, what does this general thought of something that's fraudulent or not incredibly legitimate do? And how do you respond to it? These are some of the questions. And again, some of the obstacles. Another incredible obstacle, especially in a place like Italy, but it's not just here, is tradition. And it's not that tradition is an obstacle to sort of making work or thinking broadly or openly. It's that the way that tradition has been defined for us a lot of times is pretty stagnant. It's been defined most of the time, I don't have the definition here, but as something that is simply blindly passed down from one generation to the next and followed, adhered to. And I like to read this wonderful essay by T.S. Eliot, Tradition and Individual Talent, which says, yet if the only form of tradition of handing down consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to its successes, tradition should be positively discouraged. You know, he goes on to define a better understanding of what tradition is and the ways in which tradition is something that we need to find our own position in relation to in order for it to make sense. And I think this is really important in a place like Italy that would seem so steeped in traditions that are simply about conserving something that doesn't change, and the ways in which actually finding our own place within that helps us to understand that all those things are mutable. We can change that. Here, sorry for the more aggressive image on the right. This is a recent cover by Saul Williams, who's an incredible poet. The name of the poem is at the bottom here, but I like the way that Saul pushes us to create a more concrete understanding of a very abstract thing, that of beliefs. He says, some thoughts traveled from distant places are not born within our borders and must pass through heightened security fortified by age-old tradition, the norms of societal culture, the misgivings of prejudice, misplaced judgment in order to arrive peacefully in our minds. Our minds are high-walled fortresses where security councils gather to preserve comfort, enforce what we have been taught to value and discern, and determine what is real. All these things I think are really super interesting to think about. And he asked this really wonderful question, which is, what is your mind's immigration policy? And so what determines what we allow into our mind or not, what gets rejected at the borders? And it's this wonderful shift of framing immigration policies in relation to our beliefs is super interesting. And one of the things that's a core word in there is values. The regard that something is held to deserve, the importance, worth, or usefulness of something is something that, is not fixed. It changes over time, and it's important to sort of constantly be negotiating. And just to kind of give a sense of the values of certain moments and certain reflections, what you see on the left, you might not be able to read it, but it's okay, is a letter from W.B. Du Bois to the Foreign Affairs. And he's basically asking to write about the imminent invasion of Ethiopia on behalf of Italy in 1934. And he sort of requests, he says, I think that this is an important issue for us to touch on because it was very clear that Italy was going to be invading Ethiopia, which they ultimately did. The response is basically, no, I don't think that you should, engage in this. We don't think that we can do that. But if you do write this article, please share it with us. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what this letter says. And I like to think about the way in which then, following this, you have the invasion of Ethiopia, and you have the use of chemical warfare and all sorts of illegal warfare in the colonizing of one of the last sovereign countries in the African continent. And this is really interesting in terms of the ways in which this response tells us that it doesn't tell us that there's no value in writing about that. It's trying to state it in a way that there's not interest, but then ultimately it's saying that there is interest in knowing what comes of this. And this brings us to someone you probably all know. If you don't know Carter G. Woodson, he is the person who created Black History Month in the United States. In 1923, he decided that, 1926, he decided that there would be Black History Week. And, actually just as a writer for a lot of literary journals, decided to simply make it happen. And he wrote, "This is going to be Black History Week. Everyone contribute what you want." And what happened is a lot of people responded across the nation, thinking about all of the histories that had not been told. And this quote, "Those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose inspiration," which comes from the teaching of biography and history. And I think, some of you may be familiar with Carter G. Woodson for this really incredible book, The Miseducation of the Negro. If you don't know the book itself, you might know The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, which is a very important album by Lauryn Hill, where she's sort of quoting this book. Both things are worth checking out. And these are some early posters sort of going through the years. It took 50 years for it to become a month and to be nationally recognized. I like to think about the importance of sort of teaching these histories that were not, a lot of people think about the vanishing of history. And I think a lot of times it's just about what we choose to sort of share more than the vanishing. And obviously in this period, which is true also today, Black history in the United States was very undervalued. And I don't think that it was just undervalued, but it was strategically left out of the narrative. The history books in the 90s that I was reading in school carried very little information. And this is a man who's actually my grandfather, Randolph Bromry. And Randolph Bromry was one of many inspirations that I have in my life, who did all these amazing things in life. He was a Tuskegee Airman. He was a geophysicist. And he was also a jazz musician. And all these things sort of came together throughout his life when he was the first Black chancellor of the University of Massachusetts. While he had that role, W.B. Du Bois was given an honorary degree from him. And ultimately, when Du Bois died, my grandfather went to retrieve all of the papers and documents of Du Bois from his wife, and to bring them to the University of Massachusetts to found the W.B. Du Bois Library, and to create an endowment that would digitize all of that work moving forth in the future to make it accessible. That's where I got the document that you saw before. So this figure has been really important, more specifically for me in my own reflection. The other thing that's really particular about my grandfather that I'd never really considered until more recently is that he's a Black Italian. In that his mother was a white Italian orphan from Parma, who was raised in the United States by an African-American family in the South. And she married an African-American jazz musician, and my grandfather is their offspring. So my grandfather, when I got married in Italy to an Italian, he was extremely excited about the ways in which he thought that the circle had been closed again in relation to his mother and his history. Again, something I hadn't really thought about, but you'll see through my work a reflection on the significance of Italianness and the ways in which it's been designed as a sort of something that's in conflict with Blackness is really short-sighted and actually inaccurate. Here is another one of my sort of hero legends is Paul Robeson, who I mentioned earlier. This is a beautiful image by Charles White, who, if you don't know his work, he's an incredible painter, and this is just one of many incredible images. This is one of the statements that was made by Paul Robeson in Madrid in 1937. At the height of his career as an actor in 1937, he went to Spain, to Madrid, to sing at the front lines of the Spanish Civil War in order to fight fascism. He literally went and stopped the battle for the time of his singing. These are statements that were made right after Guernica happened. Guernica was bombed. And he says, today, the artist cannot hold himself aloof. Through the destruction of certain countries of the greatest of man's cultural heritage, through the propagation of false ideals of racial and national superiority, the scientist, the writer, the artist is challenged. The challenge must be taken up, for this culture, a legacy from our predecessors, is the foundation upon which we build a higher and all-embracing culture. It belongs not only to us, not only to our present generation, it belongs to our posterity and must be courageously defended. This is where that word posterity of the lecture comes from. So in 2016, I had been living in Florence, Italy for roughly 16 years. And I'd been doing a lot of my work as an artist, sort of showing and developing things in the United States and also a little bit in Italy. Italy started to be a little less attractive for showing my work because it was incredibly complicated to do all the behind the scenes work. You basically had to do everything from the behind the scenes, the development, the production, the publicity, the transportation. When the work came down, you had to fill the holes in the wall, that kind of thing, if you could put them there in the first place. All these things became sort of hurdles for me in my own work. But then as I sort of started to get together with some people and to think about the importance of establishing a reflection on Black history in the context of Italy that wasn't centered on US history, but was centered on a much more global perspective of Blackness. There is no Black community in Florence, Italy. There's a bunch of Black communities, meaning that the communities tend to define themselves not as Black, but as Senegalese, Eritrean, Nigerian, Somalian, and so on and so forth. And so the notion of unity that I think is so fundamental in the United States context is something that I really struggled to try to put together when I came over here. And I think Black History Month Florence was a bit of a response to that. It was a response to feeling a responsibility towards the incredible history, again, that goes back, the earliest records of Italy through sort of like Roman writing, record interactions with Africa and Africans. And so there's always been this presence. There's always been these people on this territory. But somehow it was written out of the narrative. And it was written out of the narrative in part during the moment of the transatlantic slave trade, where some of the beneficiaries of that trade in terms of the economics didn't want to sort of continue with the sort of more equal reflection or some of the praise that was actually going towards African leaders and African technology. And they wanted to replace it instead with a different narrative that would really help to justify slavery. And then we all know the history that moves into the modern period. Following that, there's a long space in between, and Blackness is everywhere. And in a space like Italy, that means Blackness goes way, way back, and it's always over here. But interestingly, it's just right now that we're starting to have a really direct conversation about a Black Italian identity. This is something that wasn't much of a conversation in the past, not because there were not Black Italians, but because somehow this didn't become sort of a meditation in language. So right now, it's a really magical moment because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. This is the image for the very first edition of Black History Month Florence, which we basically created 20 events together. Me and Andre Halyard, who is native to Queens, New York, who's been here in Florence for the past 30 years. We worked together to create this program. And the idea was basically to create something that was sustainable in that a lot of people told us that you can't make events without a lot of money, and we didn't have any money. And so what we decided to do was to go into all of the different organizations that are working in Florence and ask them what they were doing in February and ask them if they wanted to do something dedicated to Blackness that would fit within their general program. In doing this, we collectivized the program and we created a network of people who were interested in pushing towards similar objectives. I'll just have a couple images from that very first edition that included Afro-German artist, Anika Joyce Sadiq, who was in Florence for years, fellowship, Kevin Jerome Everson, who has done, he was my professor in cinematography and who you'll see here and there throughout this presentation because he's always in and out of Italy and I'm always inviting him to do things. We took moments like a Bob Marley tribute, which typically happen where people play music, and use it as a moment to really talk about the legacy of Bob Marley, talk about the history of that music. The image you see in the center is Senam Okudzeto talking with a local Florentine curator at a space that is the Modern Art Museum in Florence, dedicated to Marino Marini. And then Bilal Oliver playing as well. So we were really, of course, the energy that we were able to create in this very first edition was quite magical. And we decided that we wanted to carry it forward. I'm not showing you, but we actually had like a lot more events than what you see there. And they were children's events, there was theater, there was film, there were tours. It's a lot of different things. But we wanted to really up the stakes for the second edition. We started working together with this incredible curator named Janine Gale, who's still the co-director of Black History Month Florence at this point since 2017. And we really wanted to really think about Italy as a context. All the images you see here are images of Black Italians in history, going back to the Renaissance period. We upped it. And so we made 50 events with the second edition with 50 partners. And it was amazing the way in which this was able to expand. I'm not going to talk to you much about these figures, but I might point out the figure at the bottom right, whose name is James Cenaze. And he is the offspring of an African-American soldier who was in Italy during the Second World War, and a Neapolitan mother in Naples. And he's this incredible musician and keeper of the Neapolitan tradition of folk music. But he also has this whole jazz side that he says comes from him trying to trace the roots of his father. Incredible figure in terms of that legacy and what that represents for Italy. And of course, one of many, many, many people of that generation that have a similar story. You can see we did all sorts of workshops. There was a cinematography workshop, a cooking workshop, a kizomba dance workshop. We did many, many lectures. And so these were new formats that we were examining. Kevin Jerome Everson, Enrico Riley, Lazzaro Hanja is a choreographer, and Nicole Miller is a filmmaker. And then exhibitions. As an artist, I've always seen to it that we really have a lot of exhibitions that we do. And I'm not going to spend much time with them, but just to tell you, we had things like an exhibition dedicated to African female artists working in the realm of video art. And this is just one of many ways in which we are creating different kinds of reflections. In 2018, I'm just going to go really quickly through this, but we had a lot more people. These are all the protagonists. We did 60 events and a really incredible span of people that were involved really directly in creating work in Italy. There's the list. Then we did many more exhibitions. I think we opened 12 exhibitions in February, all curated by us, by Black History Month Florence. Some of them dealt with history more directly, like this is Patrick Joel Tacheda Yanku. You'll hear his name later. He's an artist originally from Cameroon who's been based in Bologna for many, many years now. We also decided to take it to the streets and to try to think about different publics and different audiences for the work we're doing. We created a show called Black is the Color of My True Love's Hair, where we invited 6 photographers to give us images that we could print on posters and put outside of this abandoned building in the center of Florence that happens to be right in the center of a neighborhood that has a large immigrant population. And, it was really just a way to sort of bring to the streets some of the reflections that we wanted to have about identity to make it so that these are images that are accessible also to the people that are on the streets without needing to sort of step in. Another intriguing project that I was super excited to do is called Lagos Soundscapes. And we were able to get Emeka Ogbo to give us one of his works to present inside of a Nigerian grocer. So this is a really tiny grocery store. And what we presented was the sounds of the Lagos market. This grocer is one where people, a lot of Nigerians and other Africans gather just to have a drink, to sit down. In the grocery store, there's stools. And so we put these headphones there so that you can actually listen to the sounds of the market and think about this idea of displacement. in this space, but also nostalgia and all the memory that comes through sound. We did many other projects, and I'm going to kind of go through these last things to make sure that we have time for questions and answer after. But the number of events you can all find on our website, blackhistorymonthflorence.com. You'll see it's extensive, and there's a lot of diversity in the range of work that we've done, a lot of which was commissioned specifically for Florence. So we're also thinking about Florence as a site for cultural production, and what it means for an Afro-descendant artist to be thinking about Black history in Italy. Here's a range of images that are coming from Bartolomeo Togù. Big exhibition that we did called Black Value that was dedicated to the American Academy in Rome as a space that's been hosting artists for a very long time. We put together a range of artists and we showed the work that they created while they were in Rome. And moving forth, we decided to sort of step out of the month in 2018, and we began curating exhibitions that were outside of that so that we can really begin focusing on certain subjects like Schengen, like exchange. Here's just a few images from the exhibition Schengen, project called Mediterraneo. We finally step into basically 2019 with the first themed program. And so Adagio, we decided to take words that come from musicology, and because they're Italian words that, you know, are known also in an international environment. And Adagio musically is about a sort of slow tempo, slow moving, but in the Italian language, it means slowly, but also to a certain degree, it's placed around like parking garages. It means carefully. And we like this idea of making things an invitation and a critique. So an invitation to sort of slow down and appreciate some of the complexity of what we're trying to talk about. And at the same time, a critique of the slow motion around, progress in regards to culture. I have problems with that word progress, but I'm going to use it here. Here's just a few images from different things that we were doing in that moment. I tried to highlight more of the art here than anything else, but we had plenty of other things as well. We founded in 2020 Black History Month Bologna, and actually Patrick Tacheda, the artist who I showed you earlier, is the director of that. And what we've done is we've created a training program where we can help provide strategies for localized organizing using some of the tactics that we've developed over the 5 years of our existence. Obbligato was our second theme, and it was the first shared theme with Black History Month Bologna. Black History Month Bologna put together 20 events, and we were extremely fortunate to get through all of these events before lockdown in Florence. And so some of the last lived experiences of being together without the restrictions for many in Italy were Black History Month events, which is kind of an interesting thing to sort of walk into lockdown around. This is a figure we invited in for a workshop with hip hop artists. A lot of young migrants, African migrants, tend to be in the realm of hip hop. This is Tommy Kuti, who's like an iconic figure, originally from Nigeria, but he basically grew up in Brescia near Milan. And he raps about being a Black Italian and what that experience actually means. Pamela Z, some of you may know, this is another collaboration with the American Academy in Rome. She was there as a fellow. Leif Jerlefia is someone who was a part of a project that we did, which is a residency dedicated to young Afro-descendant artists based in Italy. And she's a poet, and so we did a presentation of her work. This is Sonia E. Barrett, who's an incredible sculptor we invited in to do a project with Villa Romana. And this is an image from a lecture that we did for Sarah Redman that was done directly at the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova, which is the hospital where she practiced medicine in the mid-1800s. She's an African-American doctor. Kevin Jerome Everson again, showing his work in Florence once again. And we developed actually in 2018, and it's been extending on through since then, a project called Black Archive Alliance. We were thinking about ways in which we needed to create a series of projects that would really create a sense of the work that we're doing that would extend beyond the month of February and engage us in some research that was much needed. The reflection was that maybe if we were to look into some of the archives of Florence, we might be able to find some references to Africa. We assumed it would be difficult. Instead, what we found is that the second you open any archive in Italy, Africa is all over it. So it really made clear that it's just simply research that's not being carried out very often, but the information, the documents are there. And so we did a project where we went into these archives and set up a series of displays. We sent students in to do research. We invited scholars who had been already doing that research. We highlighted books in libraries, and we presented a series of stands within each of the spaces and produced a little catalog that's sort of like an envelope full of little texts about each of these sites. We work with 20 different spaces in Florence and their archives. Everything from the Uffizi galleries to a collection of photography that exists outside of Florence and Prato, the Sahara Desert, so the personal archive of a person who created the Sahara Desert, which was a club that hosted a lot of, well, that was frequented by a lot of African students and, kind of was dedicated to the culture. But it sort of ultimately ended up closing. And so in many ways, we also really wanted to think about the ways in which this archival information could help to answer the question when people ask us, why Florence? This was a really easy way of answering that question. What you see here is quotes from Palazzo Vecchio, which is the city hall today, which was visited by Leopold Senghor, the then president of Senegal, a recently liberated Senegal, who was invited by the man you see seated with the glasses, Giorgio Lapira, who was the mayor of Florence. And super interestingly, Senghor came in and talked about the ways in which Africa needed to be understood. Since the continent has entered the scene, the African continent with its limits, with its virtues that impose itself on reflection, but also with its implacable will to reject the barrier of the absurd, to proclaim its faith in the future of reconciled world, restored to its fullness. But why this will, why this faith? Because humanity can never be threatened any more than it has been in recent years. And this is pronounced in 1962, directly from the front steps of Palazzo Vecchio. And again, this becomes a way of thinking about a space like Palazzo Vecchio, which we historicize in a certain way through a completely different historical language. We did a volume 2 where we gathered students together with mentors, and these mentors guided them through development, a continuation of the research that was laid out in the first volume. And you can see a list here. We have a SoundCloud, a stream where you can hear some of the presentations that were done by these students. We created this year another iteration of Black Archive Alliance that was more of an installation of the archival materials from that second volume. And then I think the other project that I really wanted to make sure we got a chance to address quickly is called On Being Present. And this is a project that was proposed last summer to the Uffizi galleries. And the idea was to curate a series of scholars, historians, to write about the Black African presence in the collection itself, and to think about those histories, to think about the gaps, to think about the interpretation that was needed in absence of documentation. So the ways in which these images carried forth to us figures in history. The figure you see there's Piero Moro, and there's plenty of others. You can take a spin on the Hypervisions section of the Uffizi Gallery's website and see a list of 9 scholarly entries. I followed this up. I was invited by the museum this summer to do a follow-up series of personal reflections on the significance of these works and of the research to sort of celebrate the project, which was launched in January. And that's called Black Presence, and you can find those videos under the video section of the Uffizi Gallery's website. You can hear some of my meditation on these things, but I thought it was really important for us to think about the ways in which simply addressing the presence of Black people in a space can be controversial. And it was really interesting because we had actually a lot of resistance also from local right-wing organizations that didn't want us talking about the Black figures that have been in the collection since the 1600s. So that tells you where we're at here. This is an image celebrating the residency that we created. Again, we invited 5 Afro-descendant artists to come to Florence and collectivize for a 10-day workshop thinking about diaspora in a space of non-performativity. And these artists, we've been developing with them since that moment of February towards the creation of exhibition of their work, together with a series of researchers who are doing the next chapter of Black Archive Alliance. So everything sort of comes back around and comes together. This is a really quick side note about my own research for a project called Fine Tooth Combs, and the way in which it's really about putting together a series of 10 years of interviews with Afro-descendant artists coming through the space of Italy, asking them about context, and then it gets transformed into something like this, which is basically a sound archive where you have overlapping reflections and meditations on Blackness in this space. I'm going to sort of close with this here, and that way we can kind of move into question and answer in case there are some questions. The recovery plan is a project that was launched last year because I really wanted to make sure that we could begin to think about our work with Black History Month Florence outside of the month, encompass all these research projects, and actually take on a physical space to have a center. The Black Cultural Center that a lot of people are familiar with in the United States doesn't really exist here. And so we wanted to do one, and we decided to call it the recovery plan as a way of thinking about these kinds of things, right? About disaster recovery. And I can tell you that Black history in Italy is really quite a disaster in terms of the ways in which it's been, unreported on, hidden away, manipulated through sort of a colonial lens, and overall sort of forgotten about. And so I like to think about this sort of little checklist of what to do in order to create a recovery plan, in order to back things up. And I want to think a lot about like what we're actually recovering from, what we're trying to recover in the first place. And these are the things that sort of fuel us. We did a pop-up version of the recovery plan, occupying a gallery space in the center of Florence with a series of an exhibition, which you can see here, which are all responses thinking about Florence, thinking about Italy. This one is commemorating a racist murder that took place in Florence in 2018. But we also had a number of different works. We had a video screening room with a series of works thinking about colonial history. We had a loaned library where we brought in books from different scholars of the city that were addressing Blackness and made them available to different publics. And this project is actually taking us towards a goal of having a space. At the moment, we're actually working towards, which we had workshops as well, dedicated to sound, dedicated to drawing. We had conversations with political leaders in the city. Ultimately right now, the thing that we're working on in this very moment is the recovery plan occupation of a space near Milan, a museum called Maga, where basically we've been asked to occupy a series of different spaces with the artists that we had invited in for the research residency in February. So the young under 35 Afro-descendant artists. We've decided to create this coupling, and we basically put each of the artists together with a researcher who's working in the field that the artist is engaged in, to create a new reflection that expands both the scholarship and the art. And we're presenting the art and the archival work in the same space in 5 individual exhibitions that will be opening starting in October and going through January. We've developed also a lecture series, which I've been sort of pitching around to different universities as well. And what you see here are the list of artists and scholars and for the lecture series that we're putting together. And all of these are our Black Italian artists and Black Italian scholars. And so really thinking about what it means to really put this on the map. It may seem really unremarkable in the context of the United States, where the gathering of Black people in terms of the arts is not rare at all. In Italy, this has literally never happened. And so we're working on the very first time that an exhibition has been dedicated to Black Italians. And we're working with them on a really crucial development of the sort of research and history that goes into what they're doing and what they stand for. And myself and Janine Gale, that you see on the bottom there, the co-director of Black History Month Florence, we are doing a lecture ourselves to talk a little bit about curatorial activism and what it means to sort of curate activism, or to think about activism as a curatorial practice. Anyway, so I'll go ahead and stop the share there. And certainly if there are any questions, I would love to, have an opportunity to answer them. And Rocky, you can feel free to chime in as well if you have some questions or reflections.
Yeah, hang on. Hi. I don't know. I can't see. Can you see participants? I can't see any participants. Which is
I can see participants. There's 52 participants. If anybody wants to write something in the chat or in the Q&A section, I'm happy to answer any of the questions that you have.
Oh, great.
Yeah, but for now, there's none here so far in terms of questions.
Yeah, I wanted to see. I have like a million questions, but I'll just ask a couple. So how do you feel, I guess, with Black History Month Florence kind of borrowing, obviously like borrowing the language of Black History Month in America that focuses primarily on African-American identity, like specifically, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess, how does that translate into the broader aspects of African diaspora as it pertains to Italy? Because like you said, it's Senegalese, it's Eritrean, it's people from Ghana. I mean, it's really all over the place. So do you feel, I guess, culturally, you're not really sharing, you're sharing a common heritage, but not a common identity? Does that make sense? And so somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois, who's talking about African-American identity, is not, does that translate to people from Ghana as readily, or do they, is there I guess it's more multicultural, it's not just, it's just more multicultural. So I was wondering how have you seen that play out with Black History Month Florence in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. Honestly, so W.B. Du Bois is a really interesting figure because, of course, from 1900, he was very interested in sort of conversations about, a more global perspective on Blackness, right? Pan-Africanism. And so we have him in dialogue with a number of similar figures that are coming from all across the diaspora. And so as a figure, I like to look at some of that work, some of which is short-sighted, but it's truly incredible work that was being done in that time period in response to a global connectedness that, was understood, but maybe not, with the world not being quite as connected as it is now, not experienced directly as often. I think in the context of Italy, really one of the main goals was that in putting together Black History Month Florence is that the frame for thinking about Blackness in this space tends to be so incredibly small and flat. It's constructed through the media. This is true across the world. In the United States, it's really hard to expand the frame of Blackness in the United States to be, to consider the Africans that have arrived in the United States even recently, right? In the ways in which they make up a part of the Black community, right? To really sort of be inclusive with that language is complicated because we have this sort of history, and we like to think of, U.S.-based understandings of Blackness as tethered to slavery. I think that, of course, that's really, that's a flat understanding of Blackness in that context. It's much more expansive than that, right? It's much more complex. And in the context of Italy, some of what we really want, a lot of the understandings of Blackness tend to fall into a portrayal of migrants. And the reflection tends to come through understanding of migration in the last 10 years, roughly. And that reflection also tends to understand all of them as coming from the same place, coming for the same reasons, and all of that. So they have an incredibly flattened narrative. And so some of what we've tried to do through Black History Month Florence is to sort of really render much more complex the kind of narration that we can have around Blackness in this space, create a reflection on Blackness itself that I think, it literally does not translate in Italian. So we have the problem of translation. Black here doesn't really, it translates, you could say it, but the significance that it carries with it doesn't quite work. I'm part of a project right now where I'm working together with a translator on the translation of the Undercommons, and really think about Fred Moten writing about Blackness. And it's been intriguing because we're having long conversations about the significance of translation and how things don't translate. And then sometimes things need to be translated. And we have this really wonderful moment here in Italy, again, around the construction of identity, where we have space to actually really render for people what Blackness actually means, right? In a way that maybe it wasn't understood before more broadly, you know? And I think that that's something that is really, really powerful. And yeah, it's complicated. I personally chose to use Black History Month Florence in English because I want to acknowledge where I'm coming from. I want to acknowledge, you know, that this isn't some Italian perspective on this thing. This is me saying this. This is two African Americans that came together and said, let's do this. And I think it's also something that has become more internationally. And, you know, I think that the fact that Black History Month shows up in Amsterdam, shows up in London, all these things make it really interesting because, of course, then it takes on a different meaning in each of those spaces. One of the things that I've been spending a lot of time with is creating European solidarity. So really thinking about the people that are doing this work in other parts of Europe and what we might be able to learn from each other. So we have an anonymous attendee's question. It says, would you say that Italy as a country is more behind / reluctant than the United States in inclusivity? You know, it's kind of complicated to state in that way. In a certain sense, certainly in terms of the dialogue that's happening around ideas of diversity, of inclusivity, around Blackness more broadly, or more specifically, there's really not a lot of conversation. And a lot of the conversation that might have been there has been snuffed out through fascism and the colonizing of Eritrea, Libya, and Somalia. And because that's really recent history, and because the dismantling of the colonies in Italy really correspond to the end of World War II, roughly, although in Somalia it did continue. There's a reluctance to really dive into thinking about Italian colonial history. There was no decolonial moment. There wasn't a decolonizing. It just simply ended. And, you know, the implications of that we're seeing right now. Italy is a place that sees, I read that in 2018, there was 25,000 migrants that arrived on the shore of the country. And you can imagine we hear every month about how many people are dying in the Mediterranean crossing over this way. And, you know, that makes it quite complicated picture of the demographics of the country. And what a lot of people don't pay attention to are two things. One, that as much that might seem like a huge influx of people, and it really is, the outflux of young Italians who are leaving the country, there's about 250,000 that left the country in 2018 looking for jobs, because there's not really a lot of jobs in Italy. And also these 25,000 that are arriving in Italy are not actually trying to get to Italy. They're trying to get into Europe, and Italy is not really known for providing work in these ways. And so, I mean, I think those things make for a more complex story about inclusivity. Most of a lot of the boats that are coming over are coming directly from Libya. They're coming directly from Libya. I'm sure that you have all read in international news about the state of Libyan prisons that are keeping these migrants. And a lot of that is being enforced by Italian governance. And this Italian governance has a long history because Libya was an Italian colony. And so you have this extra layer of thinking about the legacy, the colonial legacy of Italy, and the ways in which it is directly implied in the kind of relationship that's been established right now to try to keep people from leaving Libya in the first place, you know. Cool. So we have one, I see another question that popped up in the chat. but from Angela Lee, it says, and I hope I'm stating this well, am I hearing you say that Italy has a young history of a uniquely Black Italian history? And how are Black Italians documenting the history behind what we see in the performances we saw? Is there a drive to fill that with anything from the United States, like current movies, music, cultural representation of Blacks from other countries? Thank you. Yeah, it's a really great question and a really good reflection. It's, you know, Italy doesn't really have a short Black Italian history, but the construction of the identity of Black Italianness is very current. It's very recent. It's not that Black Italians didn't exist in the past, but the conceptualizing around that, the development of the language for it, is something that's really taking place in recent times, in the past 20 years, I'd say. And, you know, in that, it is interesting. One of the things that we've done with younger Black Italians that we've worked with is to think about what it means for a lot of the sources that they have to come from outside of Italy. You know, because again, not so much has been written in this regard. Not so much as like common knowledge for like heroes or sheroes or leaders or anything. To have to come from outside of Italy is already in and of itself problematic, given the incredible history that the country has. And that's something we've been really working on. And there's a lot of people that are working towards it as well. And a lot of people talked about, you know, I've got a great friend of mine who's Black Italian who told me that he really came into himself by going to hip hop clubs in Milan and finally seeing that, like, they're like seeing Black music, Black people together, and being like, you know, understanding this was something that he could attach himself to. So yeah. There's another, there's two more questions that popped up. I'll go with the one that's in the Q&A first. It says, from Tiana Trigg, how do you feel about European museums considering with returning African arts back to African countries and some of the feedback that came with it? Also, thank you for introducing me to the Black Italian's perspective. As a Black American, it's rare to hear about the point of view of other Blacks of different nationalities. Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. It's kind of some of what we stand for. And you might be interested, there's a book by a guy named Johnny Pitts called Afropean that is examining some of the diaspora across Europe, specifically in Black European identity in different ways. So, I mean, I think the conversation that's happening about around restitution is a really complex one, and one that is also not that complex at the same time. The intriguing thing is that the focus tends to be, it's actually been generated more around objects that are originating from Africa and that were looted, mostly during sort of colonial invasion. But I think what's interesting is that if we really think about the history of museums, the history of museums is that of looting. And so it's not just of African objects, it's the looting of all sorts of objects. And so a lot of times there's some scholars, and I'm forgetting, she'll have to forgive me, this incredible scholar who talks about the fact that the museum comes about as a space that is necessary when the looting becomes so much in terms of its quantity that it needs a space, a physical space. And this is the truth. I mean, if any of you have ever been to spaces like the Louvre, you know, what you're looking at, like if you you know, it doesn't take very long to understand that what you're looking at is looting, dating back all across history and coming from all different geographies. And so, you know, restitution as a conversation, I think, is an important one. There's an artist, Sami Balogi, who we've done work with, who is doing a lot of work around what it means for some of the oldest objects in existence that come from what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, to not be in the country and to be in museums in Europe. And so to not have their ancient history present in the country. I think it's a really interesting thing to think about. You know, it's an ongoing struggle and debate, and there's ideas about who's capable of conserving things. But I think that there's also a lot of really confused understandings about conservation in regards to objects that have specific functions as well. And this is something that just makes it much more complicated. So I'm reading one more comment here in the chat. It says, this may be short-sighted or convoluted comment, but your biography of growing up in New York and planting in Italy reminds me of African-American expatriate artists in the early 20th century, such as Richard Wright, James Baldwin. Do you relate to such examples in your work, in artistic growth story? Why or why not? Does this story feel similar or different? That's a great question. You know, I actually, the 10 years of interviews that I've been doing with African diasporic artists is actually really about getting to that. I spent a lot of time when I first came over here to Italy to live, diving through anything I could get my hands on that talked about African-American expats. Because it didn't seem like something that a lot of people who were here could really inform me about. And I knew that there was a history, and I knew that that legacy was one that I wanted to think about. I wanted to think about the ways in which, what people found when they left the country. And of course, you can imagine that, like, of course, in the period of Jim Crow in the United States, leaving the country and coming over here is liberating in all sorts of ways, right? And it's not because racial prejudice didn't exist here, but because it's different. there's a different kind of racial prejudice. There's a different way in which you live it, and there's ultimately a different kind of engagement with racism that doesn't have the same histories. So you know, coming here, that the racism that you're seeing is not rooted in slavery in the way that we understand it in the United States. We know that it's not rooted in the history of policing as it is in the United States. These things are, it might seem like little when you still have racism all over the place, but those things are actually really liberating to not have to deal with that, right? We have to deal with all sorts of other things here, so I'm not trying to paint it rosy. And I know that the artists that came over, such as Baldwin and Wright, that I certainly look at and think about a lot. Ellison, lots of visual artists, Edmonia Lewis is one of them. There's plenty of artists that have been coming over here for many years. And I think that one of the things that I've always found magical is the ways in which they were able to come here and for the first time maybe connect with some African communities that were, that they might not have been aware of in the United States, and the ways in which that opens perspectives. In my first year of living in Italy, I was able to sort of encounter and hang out with Tunisians, Moroccans, Malians, Senegalese, and the way in which that completely blew up my worldview and my understanding of Blackness was huge, you know? So I think there's a lot of ways to think about similarities and differences, but it's something I'm constantly negotiating. And then I see another question here that is from, that question before was from Caleb Clemente. Thank you for that. This one is from Connor Delgado. And it says, a lot of your work practice involves a component of examining who and what we value and what value means. How do you think about what you do in your work in terms of its labor, class, cultural aspects, and what see?
These are like lectures unto themselves. Like the answers to these questions.
Yeah. I mean, you know, one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time with more recently is the ways in which the labor of the artist is discredited. You see that in the project that I've done around jazz musicians. But I did a residence in Senegal last, well, it was actually maybe a year ago. And I went to this rural village where actually, believe it or not, there's the Joseph and Annie Albers Foundation residence there in a place that's called Cynthia. And it's a really tiny rural village and about 8 hours from Dakar, driving inland. And I knew that I didn't have a lot of time there. I had about 10 days. And I just wanted to take some things in. I just wanted to sort of look. And I needed to find a meditation for that. And what I did is I made a drawing, a single drawing. The entire time that I was there, I was working on this sort of accordion style book and really just repeating the same image over and over and over and over. And I'm a workaholic, as I said. I sat on that chair from 8 o'clock in the morning until 10:30 at night, every single day, just fixed in that position, doing that drawing. And I've never felt so lazy in my life. And so there's a way in which, you know, these ideas about labor in relation to art, also for us as artists, are complicated. You know, our own relationship to labor and the value that we give to it is something that is informed and influenced by the society in which we live in that undervalues what we're doing. And so I like to think a lot about the ways in which artists have always been involved in reflections on class struggles and designing certain aspects of language for that. And I think it's really, really important to understand the value of the work that we do through that lens. There's a quote from Percy Shelley, and Percy Shelley talks about poets, but I'm going to say artists. And the quote goes, artists are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And I like to spend a lot of time to think about why they're unacknowledged. You know, so what is it in terms of the societal values that doesn't allow us to acknowledge the incredible work that artists have done in shaping society today?
We should probably wrap up.
That's it.
Yeah, it's been a long. First of all, I want to say thank you. That was absolutely incredible. I am fully planning on watching it again later. Yeah. And I also want to say go to bed. It's like 1:30 in the morning where you are, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So thank you so much for staying up with us. I know everybody is I'm gonna have a lot of questions about it later. This was really great, and for my own sake, it was really great to see you again.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone who followed and stuck with it. Sorry for the extremely long lecture. I tried to put in a little bit of everything, and you can see some of the work. I mean, blackhistorymonthflorence.com is the website that documents that work. The forthcoming major museum occupation is a whole new level, and we'll be posting all sorts of things of that also to Facebook and to Instagram, where it's listed as BHMF. And then, of course, you know, my own work. My website is kind of just an archive. It's justinrandolphthompson.com. If you go in, you'll see a pile of, like, I don't know, hundreds of projects. And you can certainly spend some time with it. And I'm open in case you want to reach out through Rocky or any of the faculty. I'd love to be in touch with everyone.
Cool. Thank you so much. This was really amazing. I know everybody really enjoyed it as well. So thank you, everybody who attended. And thank you, Justin. And please get some good rest. It's late.
All right. You take care.
See you later.